I know we're starting late. Hello, 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 and I missed you all. You know, this is the season where I'm a little busy trying to get these kids together and these programs together. Now, we're going to wait for a couple of more people to come in and we're going to talk about Juneteenth. And happy Juneteenth, everybody. But where did it come from and what does it really mean? We're going to find out.
I believe on this song. I am free.
The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor.
Historically, blacks were not free with any kind of communication from the government until June 19th.
Juneteenth is the day in which enslaved individuals in Texas learned that they were free.
Juneteenth is a day to pause and to reflect and to really assess where we are.
When the announcement was made, the slaves began right away to celebrate and being thankful to God for being free.
There was a time when we were not free to do what we wanted to do, couldn't go and come, families were destroyed and broken up.
I think there's a lot of confusion today amongst the younger generation about what Juneteenth is and who celebrates Juneteenth.
Every year on June 19th, African Americans in Texas gather to celebrate the Juneteenth holiday. The 19th of June is a special day, a day representing freedom from slavery. It all began in 1865 when Union soldiers led by Major General Gordon Granger landed at Galveston, Texas. There, Granger stood outside Ashton Villa and announced that the Civil War had ended and that the enslaved were now free. This was 2.5 years after President Abraham Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation. Granger's general order would finally free the last 250,000 slaves whose bondage had been essentially unaffected by Lincoln's proclamation.
Galveston was a very important place. It was like New York City. Galveston was a metropolis.
Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, as important as it was then, and in some ways, it's become even more important as a statement of the United States since that time. It really was symbolic in many ways, because when he issued it in January 1863, it did not go into effect. In other words, the South or the Confederates did not free their slaves at that time.
It had little effect in Texas because communication got there kind of slow. There were no federal troops in this part of the nation. So there was nobody to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation.
The issue here in Texas is that the Union Army was not in control, and slaves were not fools, and they were not suicidal. So to get up and walk off the plantation, indeed, if you were successful in
I think we need to keep reminding people that that was a condition, horrible condition under which we existed for years and years and generations, and the actual end to it should be commemorated and celebrated. So it's always been a major part in my family and the community that I grew up in East Austin.
The first celebrations of Juneteenth were used as political rallies and to teach freed slaves about their voting rights. Within a short time, however, Juneteenth was marked by festivities throughout the state.
Oh, brothers, keep your lamps trimmed and burning.
Very quickly, Juneteenth became a cultural celebration.
Juneteenth, I think, caught on in the later years as blacks started to socialize more together, start to form their own conventions, whether they were church conventions, as they started to go to school, and the day became more definitive because word was slow.
Many traditions continue today. Rodeos, parades, baseball games, and barbecue are just a few of the typical Juneteenth activities. Juneteenth almost always focused on education and self-improvement.
The freedmen embraced June 19th wholeheartedly. It was a day to remember what life was like before emancipation.
Most of the festivities were held in rural areas around rivers and creeks that could provide for activities such as fishing and horseback riding. Often, church grounds would be the site for such events. In time, however, black groups collected funds to purchase tracts of land for their celebrations, including Juneteenth. A common name for these sites was Emancipation Park.
There were different locations around Austin where they would celebrate, and it was like they would come in shifts because everybody didn't get off at the same time. So you see the maids were there, the cooks were there first, the laundresses at the celebration grounds, but the chauffeurs, they couldn't leave until they got off work in the evening.
There are accounts of Juneteenth activities being interrupted and halted by white landowners demanding that their laborers return to work. However, in many cases, employers allowed their workers to take the day off, and some even made donations of food and money. For decades, these annual celebrations flourished, growing continuously with each passing year.
It was the one annual holiday that African Americans owned. And when they came to celebrate, it was a way of looking at the past, but also trying to understand the present to move to the future. And so it went beyond celebrating by having baseball games and barbecues. There also were long speeches and luminaries from the Black community present to remind one of the dark past of slavery and the promises of the present.
At one time, 30,000 people gathered at Comanche Crossing in Mejia, Texas, for the Juneteenth event. In the towns and cities, parades were held, and often a Juneteenth queen would be selected. In Austin, Juneteenth was first celebrated in 1867 under the direction of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Austin parade featured the Goddess of Liberty.
In 1888, they rededicated the new Capitol. And at the top of the new Capitol, they placed a Goddess of Liberty. Prior to this year, the freedmen would have these huge parades, and they would have floats with a lot of little children. Usually there were children on it representing each state. But in the Juneteenth of 1889, they elected the Goddess of Liberty. And each year after that, up until the 1930s, when it went out of vogue and they started calling her the Juneteenth Queen, they had a Goddess of Liberty.
Jaybird sitting in the top of the tree, tra-la-la-la-lee.
When Juneteenth was celebrated back when we were children, Dad would dig a hole in the ground out in the yard and put wire over that hole that he would dig, and put the wood and all that down in the hole, and he'd barbecue. Well, most neighbors did that because they didn't have the barbecue pits. And you could smell it all over the community.
Big days of barbecues and all kinds of food, good cakes. I can remember the ladies from our church. It was a big thing. All the different potato salads. I've never had so many different potato salads except on Juneteenth. But yes, I was fortunate enough to celebrate. I can remember slightly on a site in Austin that's called Old Emancipation Park.
The early celebrations always had the participation of the governor of Texas and the members of the legislature. The governor would allow the organizers of Juneteenth celebrations to shoot the cannons on the Capitol grounds. And they started firing the cannons Juneteenth morning at 4 o'clock to wake up the celebrants, to alert them that it's time to get out of the bed.
They were proud of the fact that they were free, and they were proud to teach their children about it as best that they could.
I leave it's 1861 when us come to Texas. Mice were pretty good. Treat us just about like you would a good mule. Us had the hoodooism to keep mice from being mean. Us get the stick and match so many notches on it and slip up to master front steps without him seeing us and put this stick right up under his doorsteps. Every night, we'll go back to the stick and drive it down a notch. By the time the last notch in the ground, it make mice so good to us. That called hoodooism. When I was set free, my master called for me and told me I was gonna be free on the 19th of June. He said I could stay too, and he would give me $5 per month if I stay and help him with the crops. Some paid us and some didn't. I made musician after I was freed. I made my first fiddle out of a gourd. If I made musician before I was freed, they could not have bought me for any price. That's right, before June 19th.
Unfortunately, with changing social conditions, the popularity of Juneteenth began to decline. The Great Depression of the 1930s forced many people off the farms and into the cities to find work. In these urban environments, employers were less eager to give workers the time off to celebrate the date. Thus, unless June 19th fell on a weekend, there were very few participants available. The people in Luling, Texas, celebrated Juneteenth at a big annual picnic.
They had what they call the SP picnic. The Southern Pacific Railroad would stage a picnic and have these large barbecues, and they play baseball, and people would really celebrate with dances and gatherings. So it was a big deal.
The celebration of June 19th spread from Texas to the neighboring states of Louisiana and Arkansas. Celebrations were also held in Alabama, Florida, and California as African American Texans migrated there.
It's that collective spirit and the fact that African Americans migrating from Texas into California, into New Jersey, they carry with them their traditions, they carry with them their practices. And so it's a part of historic memory.
But as Black people migrated west and north to California, to Michigan, to Indiana, and places like that, Juneteenth becomes something that goes with them.
California has a big one because there's a large migration of Texans who went from here to California to live, and so they have big celebrations.
In 1978, Texas State Representative Al Edwards of Houston envisioned that blacks could have a formal celebration of emancipation from slavery. During his first year as a legislator, he authored the most meaningful piece of legislation for the black community that had ever existed in the history of Texas or any other state. He wrote and lobbied to get passed into law the bill making June 19th a legal state holiday. It would be the first official black state holiday in the U.S.
I'd gone over to the Senate and I talked to the lieutenant governor at that time, who was Governor Bill Hobby, and he said he was all right with it. I'd gone to the governor, who at that time was Governor Bill Clements. His position was, I'm not going to help you get your bill passed, but I'm not going to fight it. If you get it passed, then I'll sign it.
At a memorable and historical ceremony on the grounds of the Texas State Capitol in Austin, the bill was signed into law on June 13, 1979. Representative Edwards has since actively sought to spread the observance of Juneteenth all across America.
Other states are actually trying to get legislation that would create a holiday, just as we did in Texas, to make it a legal holiday. Buffalo, New York has the second largest Juneteenth celebration in the United States. But that June 19th has nothing to do with New York. They want to use that name just in the general sense of the meaning of freedom.
Always been a major part in my family and the community that I grew up in East Austin.
The first celebrations of Juneteenth were used as political rallies and to teach freed slaves about their voting rights. Within a short time, however, Juneteenth was marked by festivities throughout the state.
Oh, brothers, keep your lamps trimmed and burning.
Very quickly, Juneteenth became a cultural celebration.
Juneteenth, I think, caught on in the later years as blacks started to socialize more together, start to form their own conventions, whether they were church conventions, as they started to go to school, and the day became more definitive because word was slow.
Many traditions continue today. Rodeos, parades, baseball games, and barbecue are just a few of the typical Juneteenth activities. Juneteenth almost always focused on education and self-improvement.
The freedmen embraced June 19th wholeheartedly. It was a day to remember what life was like before emancipation.
Most of the festivities were held in rural areas around rivers and creeks that could provide for activities such as fishing and horseback riding. Often, church grounds would be the site for such events. In time, however, black groups collected funds to purchase tracts of land for their celebrations, including Juneteenth. A common name for these sites was Emancipation Park.
There were different locations around Austin where they would celebrate, and it was like they would come in shifts because everybody didn't get off at the same time. So you see the maids were there, the cooks were there first, the laundresses at the celebration grounds, but the chauffeurs, they couldn't leave until they got off work in the evening.
There are accounts of Juneteenth activities being interrupted and halted by white landowners demanding that their laborers return to work. However, in many cases, employers allowed their workers to take the day off, and some even made donations of food and money. For decades, these annual celebrations flourished, growing continuously with each passing year.
It was the one annual holiday that African Americans owned. And when they came to celebrate, it was a way of looking at the past, but also trying to understand the present to move to the future. And so it went beyond celebrating by having baseball games and barbecues. There also were long speeches and luminaries from the Black community present to remind one of the dark past of slavery and the promises of the present.
At one time, 30,000 people gathered at Comanche Crossing in Mejia, Texas for the Juneteenth event. In the towns and cities, parades were held and often a Juneteenth queen would be selected. In Austin, Juneteenth was first celebrated in 1867 under the direction of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Austin parade featured the Goddess of Liberty.
In 1888, they rededicated the new Capitol. And at the top of the new Capitol, they placed a Goddess of Liberty. Prior to this year, the freedmen would have these huge parades, and they would have floats with a lot of little children. Usually there were children on it representing each state. But in the Juneteenth of 1889, they elected the Goddess of Liberty. And each year after that, up until the 1930s, when it went out of vogue and they started calling her the Juneteenth Queen, they had a Goddess of Liberty.
Jaybird sitting in the top of the tree, tra-la-la-la-lee.
When Juneteenth was celebrated back when we were children, Dad would dig a hole in the ground out in the yard and put wire over that hole that he would dig and put the wood and all that down in the hole, and he'd barbecue. Well, most neighbors did that because they didn't have the barbecue pits. And you could smell it all over the community.
Big days of barbecues and all kinds of food. Good cakes. I can remember the ladies from our church. It was a big thing. All the different potato salads. I've never had so many different potato salads except on Juneteenth. But yes, I was fortunate enough to celebrate, I can remember slightly, on a site in Austin that's called Old Emancipation Park.
The early celebrations always had the participation of the governor of Texas and the members of the legislature. The governor would allow the organizers of Juneteenth celebrations to shoot the cannons on the Capitol grounds. And they started firing the cannons Juneteenth morning at 4 o'clock to wake up the celebrants, to alert them that it's time to get out of the bed.
They were proud of the fact that they were free, and they were proud to teach their children about it as best that they could.
I leave it 1861 when us come to Texas. Mice were pretty good. Treat us just about like you would a good mule. Us had the hoodooism to keep mice from being mean. Us get the stick and match so many notches on it and slip up to master front steps without him seeing us and put this stick right up under his doorsteps. Every night, we'll go back to the stick and drive it down a notch. By the time the last notch in the ground, it make mice so good to us. That called hoodoos. When I was set free, my master called for me and told me I was gonna be free on the 19th of June. He said I could stay too, and he would give me $5 per month if I stay and help him with the crops. Some paid us and some didn't. I made a musician after I was freed. I made my first fiddle out of a gourd. If I made a musician before I was free, they could not have bought me for any price. That's right, before June 19th.
Hi, everybody. It's fun.
Unfortunately, with changing social conditions, the popularity of Juneteenth began to decline. The Great Depression of the 1930s forced many people off the farms and into the cities to find work. In these urban environments, employers were less eager to give workers the time off to celebrate the date. Thus, unless June 19th fell on a weekend, there were very few participants available. The people in Luling, Texas celebrated Juneteenth at a big annual picnic.
They had what they called the SP picnic. The Southern Pacific Railroad would stage a picnic and have these large barbecues, and they play baseball, and people would really celebrate with dances and gatherings. So it was a big deal.
The celebration of June 19th spread from Texas to the neighboring states of Louisiana and Arkansas. Celebrations were also held in Alabama, Florida, and California as African American Texans migrated there.
It's that collective spirit and the fact that African Americans migrating from Texas into California, into New Jersey, they carry with them their traditions, they carry with them their practices, and so it's a part of historic memory.
But as black people migrated west and north to California, to Michigan, to Indiana, and places like that, Juneteenth becomes something that goes with them.
California has a big one because there's a large migration of Texans who went from here to California to live. And so they have big celebrations.
It's the Texans. It's the Texans.
In 1978, Texas State Representative Al Edwards of Houston envisioned that blacks could have a formal celebration of emancipation from slavery. During his first year as a legislator, he authored the most meaningful piece of legislation for the black community that had ever existed in the history of Texas or any other state. He wrote and lobbied to get passed into law the bill making June 19th a legal state holiday. It would be the first official black state holiday in the U.S.
I'd gone over to the Senate and I talked to the lieutenant governor at that time, who was Governor Bill Hobby, and he said he was all right with it. I'd gone to the governor, who at that time was Governor Bill Clements. His position was, I'm not going to help you get your bill passed, but I'm not going to fight it. If you get it passed, then I'll sign it.
At a memorable and historical ceremony on the grounds of the Texas State Capitol in Austin, the bill was signed into law on June 13, 1979. Representative Edwards has since actively sought to spread the observance of Juneteenth all across America.
Other states are actually trying to get legislation that would create a holiday, just as we did in Texas, to make it a legal holiday. Buffalo, New York has the second largest Juneteenth celebration in the United States. But that June 19th has nothing to do with New York. They want to use that name just in the general sense of the meaning of freedom.
Well, I don't know for sure just when I was birthed. They didn't keep no record then like they do now. I think Master D's keeps some kind of record on us. That he been dead a long time. Time for freedom in Louisiana. They refugees us to Texas in the wagons. We travel all day and all night and had to sleep on the ground. It didn't take us long to get to Calvert out there in the bottom of Texas. And they put us on a barden plantation. We was out there digging potatoes in the fields, and the Yankees pull up in 2 big wagons. And they tells us to come off the fields and freeze us. There wasn't no celebration about it. And Master say us can stay there till us decide what to do. Well, then something funny happened there. The slaves all drink out of that well. They drink in the morning and have awful cramps by dinner time. And in the evening, they's dead. Dies like flies. So fast they couldn't even make coffins for them. They just sew them up in sacks and bury them that way. Well, some of the slaves say they think Master put some poison in that well. Well, I don't know what happened, but it sure looked funny. Freed once before, really free June 19th.
Hello?
What only got here? rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. And the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between an employer and hired labor.
You can imagine the burden lifted from these people, the men, the women, the children that knew that they were chattel property, and now understanding that they were free. But the question that was lingering was, what did freedom look like?
The slaves built this country.
They had a sense of who they were. They very quickly built a sense of community.
To what degree have we actually achieved the absolute freedom that Juneteenth promised?
Ignoring these painful histories doesn't mean that they don't still influence us.
We stand on the shoulders of those that came before us, and we need to honor their memory by telling their story.
Juneteenth, 1865 to 2021.
Galveston, Texas, a place known for tourism and quick getaways. But it's the history which happened here that impacts us all today.
African slaves were brought here on ships in the 1800s, but even after the slave trade ended, slavery here did not.
It was 1865, June 19th, now known as Juneteenth, when Union soldiers arrived and told slaves they were free.
It came 2 years after President Abraham Lincoln announced slavery had ended in the United States.
And we should remember this important date, June 19, 1865, represents the evolution of our country to a more perfect union. We were not perfect in 1528, 1619, 1776, 1865, or even the day in 2021, but we're moving, hopefully, to a more perfect union.
Juneteenth is directly related to the history of the Civil War and the emancipation of enslaved people in the Confederacy. Juneteenth is important for Texas because that is when enslaved Texans learned they were free and that the Confederacy had fallen.
So we're standing in the 2200 block of the Strand Historic District in Galveston. This was the heart of the commercial district, and at one time
was the largest city in Texas.
The largest enslaver also lived here in Galveston. They owned 7 plantations, 4 in Brazoria County, 2 in Matagorda County, and 1 in Fort Bend.
Texas was this safe haven for slavery. They did what they call the running of the slaves. That was basically moving their slaves to Texas, because there was no Union presence in Texas.
When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he knew that that would not immediately end slavery, and it didn't. And the reason is fairly simple. The Confederate States of America had formed its own country. They elected their own president. Confederate states printed their own money, which is why the Confederacy and the United States went to war. The United States' goal at the beginning of the war was just to restore the Union. The first war goal was not to emancipate the enslaved population.
And there were all these myths and stories about what happened and why it took 2.5 years for the word to reach Texas. Plantation owners in Texas were well aware of the Emancipation Proclamation, but they ignored it. What they cared about was maintaining the agrarian economy in Texas, and that was solidly based on cotton. And to maintain that, they needed slave labor. General Gordon Granger was on his way to Texas. Most of the Texas authorities had a pretty good idea what he was coming to Texas to do. Granger was in Texas for about a month. He sent his troops.
There were white soldiers and black soldiers.
Plantation to plantation, making the announcement.
Those black soldiers are people who especially helped shift the Union war goals from a war to restore the Union into a war of emancipation. It was personal for them.
They went over to the old custom house on 20th Street, to the courthouse square, from the courthouse square to the colored church on Broadway, which was Reedy Chapel.
Some of the dock workers were among the first to get the word, and so the celebrations began.
Give us a sense of what it must have been like for slaves on Juneteenth when they heard that message.
You know, that was something that was almost like going to heaven.
The celebrations, just to be so excited to taste that freedom.
the initial celebrations, there would be prayer services looking back at our journey in this country and what we had to endure in bondage. And the people who never lived to see that day, I think it's inescapable not to remember those people. Transatlantic voyage, the Middle Passage, people jumping off ships to avoid the treatment that they would have to endure.
You know, and old Marshall didn't tell you, it was free.
He didn't tell you that?
No, he didn't tell you. I think now they said it wait them 6 months out of that. 6 months. And turn them loose on the 19th of June. That's why you celebrate that day. Colored folks celebrate that day.
One of the quotes that I'm most fond of is from a former slave named Felix Haywood. Slavery could make you free, but it couldn't make you rich, because a lot of slaves thought that now that they were free, they would be rich, just like the white man.
You think about the elation, the trepidation of enslaved people, not knowing what their future holds and being enslaved and bondage being lifted from their backs.
And there was one narrative about one slave who got the word, and his sister said, brother gave a whoop and ran away, and I never saw him again.
Was the South ready to free slaves? No, we know that.
Even though the order indicated the enslaved were free, if you look at the last sentence, it gives some instructions of what they can or cannot do.
The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere.
When you're told you're free, you're thinking that, oh, I can live my life. But it wasn't like that.
On one hand, you were free by name, but the actual reality of freedom, you were not fully experiencing it.
There were a lot of very frightened former slaves, and a lot of them stayed on the plantation.
They laid the bricks in the downtown area here where we stand on many of these buildings. Not only laid the bricks, but made the bricks.
Just off Galveston's bustling Broadway Street is Ashton Villa, built in 1859 by James Monroe Brown, a loyalist to the Confederacy, dubbed an honorary colonel. Brown was also a wealthy banker, architect, and mason who designed what's believed to be Texas' first all-brick house, a palace with bricks all laid by slaves.
Anywhere you read, they will tell you that, slaves did all the work for this. They had to follow what the contractor was either telling them or showing them in order to do it. And look at this place. It's beautiful.
All of the intricacies and the detail that still stand today. It's amazing.
1859, one of the few buildings that withstood the 1900 storm.
Ashton Villa was saved from demolition in 1970. The historic home, now an event space, is operated by the Galveston Historical Foundation and home to the island's annual Juneteenth celebration.
They could leave the farm, they could leave the plantation, And they did, because so many emancipated people no longer wanted to work in agriculture because it reminded them of enslavement. For many people, the draw was labor, the opportunity to earn wages.
Working to pay off debt. The debts were never paid off. There were a lot of things that still kept the free people
suppressed.
And that's why a group of them ended up in your hometown in Houston. So they marched to Houston.
The Black population of Houston boomed. They began to build homes in the part of Houston known as 4th Ward. Houston was divided into 6 different wards at the time. And so the land in that area of 4th Ward happened to be very low and flood prone. It wasn't land that was coveted by white Houstonians at the time.
When you look at the bricks of Freedmanstown, that brick is a symbol of foundation. That brick was a symbol of hope. The brick was theirs. They made the brick, they formed the brick, shaped the brick, they laid the brick. They stood on the brick.
Iconic housing of Freedmanstown was the shotgun house. There was a door in the front and then a door in the back. And people would joke that if you shot a gun, the bullet would travel all the way through without hitting anything.
The legendary Jack Yates, this is the land where he lived, and right next door to him was his son, the printer Rutherford B.H. Yates. The first time I walked along these bricks, I was very emotional. This is where my people decided that they would survive. These are 8-pound bricks that were double baked. And the significance of these bricks is that it has that beautiful red color of the clay that was here. And the fact that they are still here today is a testament to their strength, a testament to their craftsmanship and their skill.
Oh, these are original. I reside here in Freedmanstown. I was born in Freedmanstown. This is a home that has been passed down through our family. I'm like the 5th generation. And the family operated a ice business and just drove through the community selling blocks of ice.
They did their best to gain property and to support their communities.
The wards in Houston functioned a little bit like small towns. 3rd Ward develops a Black community. 5th Ward develops one early. The Black community of 3rd Ward begins to develop around what we today call Emancipation Avenue, but that back then was Dowling Street, which was actually the name of a Confederate. Dowling is really the center of old Black 3rd Ward. And one of the reasons for that is the creation or the purchase of Emancipation Park. And it's the first public space owned by Black people in the state of Texas.
With newfound freedom came new challenges, including the fight to be seen as equal.
Freed men and women did more than survive. They built a legacy.
And it is right here, Emancipation Park,
in Houston's historic 3rd Ward.
Emancipation Park was always a place to celebrate.
2 Black church congregations fundraised to buy the park. For them, the memory of Juneteenth would have been very fresh. They were someone else's property less than a decade earlier.
I'm the great-great-granddaughter of Jack Yates. He was instrumental in purchasing Emancipation Park, where the free slaves celebrated Juneteenth.
One of the most famous families in Reconstruction era Houston were the Yates family.
He was free. However, his wife and children weren't. So he came to Texas and entered back into slavery so that he could be with his family.
They were brought here to continue to be slaves.
Once freedom came again, he knew what that tasted like. He knew what that felt like. So he took his family and moved to Houston to start a brand new life.
Jack Yates actually began helping and teaching and helping them to learn, because at that time, slaves weren't supposed to read or write.
He was a wage laborer as his day job, and at night preached near the Buffalo Bayou in Houston. And then gradually they were able to build their own church.
I'm a member of Antioch Missionary Baptist Church and have been all of my life. That was the first church that he started, but there were many other churches that he started, including Bethel in Houston.
It is that spirit, it is that zeal, it is that determination that he and others poured into the foundations when they built this church. So when you talk about World War I, our soldiers went off to fight. When they came home, Antioch was able to train and cross-train ex-veterans in masonry work, in carpentry work, and really help these ex-soldiers to find jobs and to provide homes for their families, education for their children. It was these very women from this very church who taught other women how to vote.
So many great people have been here and have been inspiring and galvanizing the community.
When I was growing up in Houston, I knew the name Yates because it was the name of a high school, Jack Yates High School in 3rd Ward, the first Black school in Houston. For a while, had just been called Houston Colored High School. As the Black community spreads and grows in other parts of the city, you need more schools. So when a second high school is established in Houston in 3rd Ward, it's named after Jack Yates.
A massive mural in Galveston's Tourist Heavy Strand District depicts the long journey to absolute equality.
Expand the narrative of Juneteenth to tell a more full story of our shared American history. The things that had been invisible are becoming visible, and the stories that have been hidden are being discovered.
Galveston Historical Foundation member and Hitchcock-born businessman Sam Collins made it his business to have Galveston's history on display. I met with him at the mural, an art installation that Sam wanted to use to paint a better picture of Juneteenth, giving it depth, dating it back to centuries before the emancipation of slaves. Artist and activist Reginald Adams brought the vision to life with detailed vignettes featuring historic figures.
And then he moves through the Middle Passage, the enslaved Africans being sold by other Africans. Harriet Tubman is an iconic female image on the mural. Then you have Abraham Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation.
The soldiers have a very prominent place within this mural. There are more soldiers than anyone else here on the mural, it seems like.
The United States Colored Troops represent 75% of the Union forces that came into Texas. Nowhere in the history books when I was in elementary, junior high, high school, or even college, did anybody teach me that colored troops help bring the message of freedom here.
Just beyond the mural and at the end of the same lot, side of the old Osterman building and where General Granger signed the orders and dispersed the troops to post them, is the Juneteenth historical marker from the Texas Historical Commission.
And I thought, how can that be? One of the most historic events in American history didn't have a subject marker.
Sam Collins spent 2 years fundraising and organizing efforts to secure one.
One of the things that I've worked to do is not to take away from what has already been told, but to add to it. This corner has now been transformed into an outdoor classroom. We're going to use technology to teach this history through augmented reality. Point their smartphone at the mural using the Uncover Everything app, and videos will pop up to expand the story so that they can learn more.
My girl Harriet and showing all the things that Black people have been going through and to be able to get the shackles off.
It all came together to create this beautiful mosaic of historian, artists, technology, visitors, tourists, people. All of that creates a beautiful picture of the expansion of knowledge, information, the history, and a lot of times they don't talk about that in the history class.
No,
so we got to get them in the picture. Not just him by himself. There we go.
His spirit and actions are one and the same,
Hey,
starting with the marker
Leo.
and now
Miss
this
Leo.
mural.
If you got
Hopefully, individuals will wake up a desire for.
hopefully you guys are enjoying this. Miss Leo, if you have Facebook, email me your Facebook because I want to start putting your stuff on my Facebook page. So hit me up on an email.
Self-discovery and discovery of history that maybe was not taught in the classroom. So now they come to the outdoor classroom.
Some of the early Juneteenth celebrations were marked by pageantry, flowers, and people riding in these very elaborate coach setups.
Regional and local Black newspapers celebrating the day. You'll see announcements about picnics that are related to the holiday.
A lot of people for those celebrations dressed up in their Sunday best. They would just be joyful. There would be parties, church services, in a lot of the communities. Whites didn't want to recognize those celebrations. If some of those former slaves had jobs, they couldn't get the day off to celebrate. A lot of the city officials said, well, you can't have your celebration in the city. And so that would push those celebrations out away from the city in rural settings, in pastures, meadows, groves, wherever. They went with the flow.
I guess my earliest memories of celebrating Juneteenth would be when I was a child. Juneteenth was always a big celebration in our community.
Eventually, you'll see the establishment of parades. We know in Houston, we do have a couple of parades. In fact, Juneteenth, Queen and King.
Family get-togethers, community get-togethers. You would have barbecue, watermelon,
ribs, and hot sausage.
Red soda pop. Those were the staples. You had to have all of that on Juneteenth. You must have that barbecue.
In recent years, Juneteenth celebrations continue to include parades and music, but most importantly, a focus on the food. And one restaurant that continues to provide Juneteenth meals, even amidst the pandemic, is Lucille's.
Feeding all the people they can, this fine dining Houston establishment, home to a culinary artist carrying on the family's legacy of African-American excellence in gastronomy. Beautiful. This Museum District restaurant is Lucille's. It is where the past meets the present on a plate. The restaurant itself is named after owner and executive chef Chris Williams' great-grandmother, Lucille B. Smith.
Often noted as Texas's first African-American businesswoman. She created the first instant hot roll mix in the history of this country, which is a recipe that Pillsbury borrowed to create their empire. This is verified by the Chicago Tribune in 2014. She was the first national African-American food editor for Sepia magazine, which is now Ebony magazine. Her client list included everybody from LBJ to the Roosevelts, Martin Luther King, to Muhammad Ali, to Joe Louis, and all points in between.
Chef Williams continues the family legacy, having hosted President Biden. But it is not just the powerful for whom he hosts or prepares food for.
So we provide service to all the historically Black neighborhoods, from Sunnyside to 3rd Ward to 5th Ward to Acres Home.
Having founded the nonprofit Lucille's in 1913, the year his great-grandmother birthed her catering business, and also the same year marking the 50th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation.
At our peak, we were doing 1,800 meals a day.
So I had a pork shoulder that I braised for about 4 hours.
It allows them to play with a ton of different ingredients.
This Juneteenth, they'll prepare more meals.
The barbecue chicken, the beans.
On top of the already 250,000 meals served.
And that's what we're working on right now for the menu for today. Getting ready to feed the people of Houston.
Delivering dignity and preserving history.
The restaurant does pay homage to her culinary freedom and creativity as a chef.
with fresh, elevated food.
It's exactly what we do over today at Lucille's. It's Southern cuisine with global influences.
The word Reconstruction sounds good, and it started out well-intentioned, but it didn't stay, quote unquote, Reconstruction, did it?
No. When we think about the period of Reconstruction, particularly here in Texas, we always have to think about the turmoil around politics.
The Democratic Party was conservative. The Republican Party was liberal. 1870 15th Amendment is what makes Black men's right to vote constitutional. And this changes the political landscape of parts of the South that had large Black populations. Black men start voting other Black men into office. Some places had Black sheriffs. So this immediately changes the politics of the South. So the Ku Klux Klan arises as the violent wing of the Democratic Party.
We're familiar with the KKK. But there were a number of white vigilante groups that existed during this time that terrorized African Americans.
By the early 1900s, the Black community had already established itself with neighborhoods, businesses, and schools, but Blacks still weren't considered as equal. With segregation and Jim Crow laws, they were still being treated like second-class citizens.
Segregation laws restricted every public space where Southerners could possibly make contact. When we say Jim Crow law, we're referring to legal segregation. Boston creates segregation laws in order to separate Black and white passengers on city streetcars in the 1840s. People in Boston started to refer to the Black section of streetcars as the Jim Crow section. They did that because Jim Crow referred to a popular minstrel figure. Early on, it was white performers, typically white men, who would blacken their faces using burnt cork, but Jim Crow was the most popular blackface minstrel character. So popular that many white people in the United States began to identify the name Jim Crow with Black people.
Here in Houston, you really can't think about Jim Crow laws without thinking about the 24th Infantry, African American soldiers who found themselves here at Camp Logan and found themselves the victims of police brutality and Jim Crow laws and segregation.
Right, you're absolutely right. In the summer of 1917, the United States enters World War I. The U.S. military was still segregated. The military was constructing a training facility called Camp Logan.
So when these 700 white soldiers show up in Houston, Jim Crow is alive and well. You got to remember, it's a new thing. And these soldiers had fought in the Spanish-American War, had gone up San Juan Hill, had fought in the Philippines. They weren't used to being treated as second-class citizens.
It all came to a head that August when Houston police officers were accused of attacking and killing one of the soldiers. Black soldiers of Camp Logan then marched from what's now Memorial Park to the city of Houston.
This was a push against Jim Crow authority.
Mutiny and rioting ensued.
It was a strike against police brutality.
16 white people were killed, mostly civilians. 4 Black soldiers died. The deadly encounter led to the soldiers' court-martial, the largest murder trial in U.S. history.
I saw the photograph of the trial. That blew my mind. Here are these 63 Black soldiers surrounded by white soldiers with fixed bayonets on their rifles. And caption said the largest murder trial in American history. And I had never heard anything about it. Nothing.
In the end, 19 soldiers were hanged, and all but 8 of 118 soldiers charged were convicted for their part in the Houston riot of 1917.
The police force of southern cities would send certain police officers to patrol Black communities. slave patrols in many parts of the South literally become police forces whose job it is to then police newly formed Black communities.
Plantations ultimately turned to prisons, with slave labor giving way to prison labor all across Texas, including Sugar Land.
This building is actually 80 years old. It was originally a prison and part of the Texas prison system.
It was an extension of the Central State Prison Farm. The big brick building, known as 2 Camp, opened in 1939.
It was a prison population of color, primarily African American, some Hispanic.
The inmates worked the fields of the state-run farm. An inmate recalled that upon arriving at 2 Camp in 1960, he was immediately ushered out into the fields to pick cotton. At the end of a grueling day, workers would return to the dormitory, where life was often just as hard.
They lived in very close quarters, actually in very hot conditions and very cold conditions.
Occupants are mostly children now, but for 30 years, this structure housed inmates.
Did you know the Freedom Tree in Missouri City is where slaves at the Palmer Plantation were notified they were free? They were told they could continue working the land, but their only form of payment would be a share of their crop. The Freedom Tree is located along Misty Hollow Drive, that's between Glen Lakes and Lake Olympia Boulevards. Walter Moses Burton was a farmer, sheriff, and politician who served 4 terms in the Texas State Senate. Burton was born into slavery in North Carolina and brought to Texas when he was 21. After emancipation, he bought land in Fort Bend County and was eventually elected the first Black sheriff in the country.
Are you registered to vote?
No, I'm not. I have tried twice. I was turned down both times. Lost my job.
You had Jim Crow laws, you had poll taxes, and slowly you see things that are going backwards.
So the first way you see a push against Black political organizing is through the Klan. Thousands of people would sometimes show up to watch a crowd of people lynch, burn, and mutilate, in some cases, Black bodies. The people who were lynched were usually people who stood up for themselves economically or politically. Self-styled, so-called militias were using violence to subdue Black voters. By the 1890s, enough violent intimidation had happened that you have white Democrats returning to power in states across the former Confederacy. The fact that we're still struggling with attempts to disfranchise voters shows exactly why we have to look at segregation as this multi-pronged attack on equality.
Dr. Martin Luther King's second day of civil rights testing in Selma, Alabama started off smoothly enough. But when the would-be registrants and those who accompanied them arrived at the Dallas County Courthouse, it was a different story.
Segregation was labeled separate but equal, but was far from it. Religious leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Fred Shuttleworth, and Houston's Reverend Bill Lawson began to help in protest against it.
The movement spreads across the South. Students at Texas Southern University especially began to boycott and then gain allies, in some cases from white students from nearby colleges.
13 of them, to be precise. On March 4th, 1960, they marched, but they went to the lunch counters at the wine gardens on Alameda, and they sat, and they sat. And so they initiated the civil rights movement in Houston, Texas.
The support and mentorship of Reverend Lawson and other folks was especially significant because in some cases, the older generation sometimes agreed more with the strategies of the NAACP, who were using the courts and using the law. Because it's important to remember that technically sit-ins are illegal.
They know that what they are doing could potentially put them in danger. They're thinking about the injustices that their parents have faced, that their relatives face. They're thinking about the injustice that they themselves are facing in a world that is supposed to be separate and equal, but is everything but equal. Well, historically, Black colleges and universities, their history is related to the fact that our nation was not ready for people of African descent to study with white Americans.
Prairie View A&M is a direct result of Juneteenth. Those individuals who heard that message that day, they went forth with the zeal and the fervor to realize what an education could do for emancipated Blacks. Most importantly, now you have individuals who could not read, who could not write. They came and got remedial lessons here and could go back out into their communities to be productive people.
I chose TSU because there was a sense of belonging that I felt when I walked on the campus. It felt like family, it felt like home, and it gave me a feeling of purpose and that I was destined to be here for a specific reason.
And we know that Prairie View produces productive people. That's one of the mottos here at the school, and it's very much tied back to that same group, that first generation who came here, who studied, thrive, and sought to make their communities better.
And as a little girl, to me, the building, Hannah Hall, was colossal. Little did I know that one day I would have the opportunity to teach at this school. This institution has been a beacon of light to people in the community.
When it came to primary education, the Gregory Institute became the high school for Houston's Black children in the 1870s. At one point, it was the only high school for Black students. In 1871, Harris County had the largest number of Black students in school in Texas, with 734 males and 760 females. The Gregory School is now home to the African American Library.
Don't forget, guys, at the end of this, and if anybody would like to come up and they would like to speak about Juneteenth, and what it means to them. And remember, this really is when Texas, the Black people in Texas, were able to be free, where other people were free, they were not. So anybody would like, remember, this is Juneteenth. People having their barbecues and everything. And then I would like to know, do you feel the need to still celebrate July 4th? So should we not celebrate July 4th and celebrate Juneteenth? Should we stand in solidarity? I said it wrong, solidarity. Or, is that a day should we relax? Because we get confused. We want to celebrate both. Should we celebrate both? Shouldn't we celebrate both? This should be a conversation. So I would like it, as soon as this is just about finished, I'm going to put the link in, and then we want to let's have a conversation. Let's have a conversation. And I would just like to know how you guys feel about it. So when this is over, Coffee, click in. This is your part of town.
Okay, I'll call you right back.
Ms. Rod, click in. I just want to know how you guys feel about Juneteenth.
After years of fighting and debate, Betsy Ross Elementary became the first public school in Houston to integrate, the year 1960. But even as the Houston School District began to eliminate segregation, there was pushback from white parents, as shown here in a 1970 New York Times article.
You know, it's really amazing how this area, this park, has blossomed and transformed in this community.
It is incredible when you think about the history of Emancipation Park. You know, there was a time when this was the only park that Blacks in Houston could come to.
And today we've seen people of all colors here.
All colors, all races, all religions, enjoying the city, enjoying the park together.
Yeah. A park for all.
A park for all. What do you think your great-grandfather purchased this property to create Emancipation Park would think of what is happening on this site today?
I'm sure he probably never thought about would this be continued 100 years later, 150 years later. But I think he would be extremely proud to know that the citizens of Houston,
Try
Texas,
this ancient
have
blood sugar
continued
fix.
to celebrate the Juneteenth.
Emancipation Park remains a pillar in the Black community, just as it did when it opened in 1872. From playgrounds, basketball courts, a theater, and the arts, it celebrates a rich history while educating the next generation. But getting that education in schools has not been easy.
I think it's just a history that some people are still so uncomfortable talking about.
We always knew what Juneteenth was. The rest of the country did not. Juneteenth isn't taught in American history. Juneteenth isn't taught in our school, in our public school system.
I guess within the last 30 years that I've learned really about a lot about Juneteenth. Attending segregated schools, we just didn't have a lot of information about slavery, and if it was presented, it was presented in such a watered down way. We knew the significance of Galveston to Juneteenth for the freeing of the slaves.
Juneteenth is so important, and it's funny, I didn't learn about it fully until I got to college, and at this HBCU that I learned about it.
As a former longtime educator, how important is that for students to be presented that information in their general education?
It's America's history. We hear the stories of immigrants coming to the United States. We hear about why they wanted to leave or why they want to be here. And everything.
How can it not be
in the
known?
United States is United States history.
All Americans need to understand when and how slaves were freed in the state of Texas.
I know that in my own class, when I'm teaching in the summer, I make sure that we do a focus on Juneteenth and we celebrate the day so that students are aware of the significance of the day and also of the significance of TSU in continuing the message of Juneteenth.
It's a huge problem not teaching youth about the history. When you go back and you say, this didn't happen, then a young person will be like, oh, so what's their problem? That never happened. So then you create more of a division between cultures.
Education is the passport to the future, but tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today. Malcolm X.
I think telling our story is very important. So if you only get one perspective all the time, you're just missing all those other shades of meaning, all those other perspectives. The catalyst for my mother writing her book, Island of Color, where Juneteenth started, is that she remembered and found a journal that her grandfather had kept. After he would say his prayers, he would write in this journal. He was writing about African American history going back to when he first came here in 1865. I think it's a treasure trove of information. Knowing one's legacy, I think, provides a sense of being grounded, a sense of belonging. It is actually foundational to our entire country because of its history of slavery.
even though things are better, but there's so much more work to do.
With the George Floyd protests, probably more Americans came together of all races and groups than have come together in this country in a long time. Really, since the Civil Rights Movement, more Americans came together.
The 2020 murder of Houston native George Floyd and the conviction of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin led to global protests and reignited the conversation of police reform.
You saw white, you saw Asian, you saw Hispanic, along with black, screaming at the top of their voices that Black lives do matter.
This bill is a bill that will speak to the hearts and minds of those who have been harmed by wrong kind of policing standards. And quickly, it will end racial profiling. It will provide training for the 18,000 police departments. It will ensure that there is a standard for excessive force, no more. A duty to intervene.
The House of Representatives passed the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act in June of 2020. But as of June 2021, it has not passed the Senate.
Hey,
Do
Bondi.
you remember when Juneteenth became a state holiday?
Welcome.
Yes, under the direction of State Representative Al Edwards, he worked very hard to get it to become a state holiday.
I'm so delighted to be in Galveston again. I'm overwhelmed at you young people who are willing to help us make Juneteenth a national holiday.
May 31st, 2021, 94-year-old Opal Lee joined by a crowd with the Juneteenth flag in tow, doing her part to push for federal recognition of the historic day.
But I'm gonna make this 2.5 mile trip. I'm gonna keep on walking. I'm gonna keep on talking to Juneteenth's a national holiday.
Affectionately known as Fort Worth's grandmother of Juneteenth. She goes across the country every year, walking.
You walked my shoes off last time.
And bringing awareness to the National Juneteenth Observance Foundation.
I'm wanting people to understand that it's just not a festival. There's so many more components to it.
Juneteenth is recognized on the state level in almost every state.
We took 1,500,000 signatures to Congress back in September, and we were so sure that we were on our way.
But the push to make it a federal holiday continues.
I just haven't given up. I just know it's about that time now that we're going to have Juneteenth a national holiday.
This is also the location of the first documented citywide celebration of emancipation that took place in Galveston. Over 800 people started a march at the old Galveston Courthouse, and they marched here to the Colored Church on Broadway, Reedy Chapel AME Church.
In 2019, U.S. Representative Sheila Jackson Lee and U.S. Senator John Cornyn authored a bill for a federal study of the Emancipation Trail. It is a proposed 51-mile route from Galveston to Houston, marking the journey of Black families sharing the news of freedom. And it is based on research by Naomi Mitchell-Carrier.
It will be a heritage tourism attraction with sites along the way where people can stop and learn the history of those sites, the stories behind them.
I would like to welcome everybody to the oldest Black Baptist church in the state of Texas.
Next steps for becoming a trail includes public input for the various locations, but the COVID-19 pandemic put a hold on it.
It is amazing, the history here in our backyard, and it's history you can experience anytime.
From Galveston to Emancipation Park, your journey starts now.
it's more than a hashtag. It's more than you just posting something on social media to recognize it, whether it be volunteering at a local Black organization or just reading about Black culture and Black history. It's important to equip yourself with those resources to make sure that we're all coming together as one people.
My ancestors decided that they were going to build institutions, learned institutions, they were going to build religious institutions where we could worship, and they was going to provide a means for their family, no matter how tethered, no matter how abused.
We have to tell the story. If we forget our history, then our future is not a future at all. It belongs to someone else. Our history, then our future is not a future at all.
All right, guys, if you want to come up and discuss what Juneteenth means to you, should we still celebrate the 4th of July? Should we do both? Like, actually, after all these years and all this history that has been hidden from us, how do you guys really feel? Come on up. Come on up. Come on up. I said, come on up. Vaughn, don't forget to press the subscribe button. Hit that subscribe button right now. And if you didn't hit that like button. Like right now. Hit it. Don't stop. Hit it. Hit it. Don't stop. Hit it. Hit it. Hit it, baby. Hit it. Hit it up. Because if not, we're going to close this up and we're going to wait for the next topic. But I thought, being that Juneteenth is coming up, I know a lot of people will be having their barbecues tomorrow. They will be having their barbecues tomorrow and resting on Sunday. So I thought I would talk about Juneteenth today. You could do it, baby. I know. You could do it this time. You could do it. You could do it. You could do it. Because, a lot of people know about it, but it's different when you live there, and she lives in Texas and she knows all these things. I would love to hear her perspective on this. Uh-oh. We got to connect the devices again. You have to allow your camera and your mic. You got to allow StreamYard to use it. Maybe when they say allow to use it, maybe you're not pushing that. Maybe you are. Come on, Coffee. One more time. Try it again. Try it again. Try it again, baby. Come on, Coffee. One more time. Try it again. Try it again. Try it again, baby. I'll give you a couple of seconds. All right, guys, we are going to close out. I thank each and every one of you for being here, especially coming to this new channel and supporting this new channel because it's all about the information. It's all about the information, and I thank you. Don't worry, I'll be back over there. I've been a little busy, so I don't know what's been going on over there. But we're going to have to catch up. We're going to do some catching up over there. But thank you guys for being over here, and I will see you guys tomorrow if you're not barbecuing and eating all that good stuff. And maybe if I'm not out eating up people's stuff. But y'all have a great night. Peace, and I am out of here.